This is the daily writing exercise, day 33, titled Duzoria. Stood at the edge of the known world was a statue. It was sculpted through the ages by many a different hand who came to seek it out for answers and a glimpse of hope. Sculpting the statue was part of the ritual and part of the answer, as the statue would never truly be finished, and neither would the person's journey. Each person touching the statue had their own vision as to how it ought to look like, and each person would sculpt it in such a way, hoping that the person coming right after them would understand the meaning and direction they wanted it to go. Then no one would ever understand it. They would always have their own interpretation, their own ideas as to how their life should be, and how the statue was supposed to help them achieve it. Samir was no different. He came to learn of the statue as any other person did in need. It was something he had thought to have overheard in some place or another. Samir couldn't quite explain when or where it was. He just knew it was something he had to seek out down at the tip end of Argentina. But not how he knew about it, Samir could not explain. It was just something he knew or had heard. The story changed quite a bit as Samir struggled to tell it without coming across as a lunatic. He booked his ticket, took a week off from work, and set out on his way towards the statue at the end of the world. He arrived there 3 days later, after a long flight and a night in Buenos Aires, and a long flight and drive and a walk to the statue. Samir was alone when he arrived at the statue. He had walked for over 3 hours and not seen a single person in sight. It felt strange, and Samir continuously wondered whether he was doing the right thing. Surely, if the statue did what it did, would there not be droves of people heading towards it in the same direction? But it seemed no one in Argentina had heard of it. He had asked his taxi driver on the way there, but he too had not heard of it, or ever even heard of someone going through the same thing as he did. Samir paid him well, with the promise to pick him up a couple of hours later, a promise Samir now obviously couldn't keep himself. Though, despite it all, Samir trudged along. He had after all a purpose in mind and intended to keep it. He arrived at the statue 3 hours after he had said his goodbyes to the taxi driver. Samir was soaked in sweat and drenched by the slow simmering rain that had started to fall 2 hours in. All the while he walked, Samir doubted himself. He doubted his purpose and point to it all. He doubted the need for his trip and the reality that was likely going to face him when he reached the statue. It wasn't going to tell him anything. It wasn't going to give him the answers that he needed. It was all going to be one big massive waste of time, though nothing could prepare Samir for the reality of it all. The statue was somewhat smaller than he had thought it would be, though at the same time it also exactly looked like how he envisioned it. The statue was a red clay monstrosity whose contours were covered in the distinct shapes of hundreds of hands and fingers trying to prod and mold it into their image. Samir approached the statue in awe. He wasn't sure what to do next and briefly considered lowering himself to his knees and letting out a quick prayer. But the statue did not compel him to do so. It instead demanded something else. It demanded he reach out to it and begin to sculpt it. It demanded to be molded. It demanded to be fed. Samir couldn't stop himself. The yearning to let it all out overcame whatever sensibility he had left. It wanted to be used. It wanted to give it all, to overflow with emotions and let all loose through his hands. Samir began to whisper as his hands sunk into the red clay. He could not hear what he was saying, for his eyes were fixed upon the clay and his hands before him. There was nothing more he wanted to do than talk. He wanted to tell everything. His tongue just wasn't fast enough. Nevertheless, Samir tried to keep up. He tried to sculpt and talk the best he could, but it just never seemed to be good enough. So Samir panicked and tried even harder, but the clay just never seemed to be satisfied. He tried and tried and tried until he couldn't try no more and stopped. He just couldn't go on anymore. He needed a rest. He needed something. He needed to go back to the taxi driver and tell him he was going to be a bit late. He needed to call his work and tell them that he would need another week off, that it couldn't be helped, that it just needed a little bit more time. Samir slowly started to sink into the red clay. The closer he got to it, the more comfortable and warm he felt inside. It was the right thing to do. He just needed a little rest. He just needed to close his eyes for a second. A quick nap and everything would be alright. Deeper and deeper he went. And the deeper he went, the more the clay wanted him. And soon enough, the red clay swallowed him whole and began its luring call right after. 30 years had passed. 30 years the red clay had fed. And now it was hungry again. No more has been written or recorded. Thank you for listening.